Bugün biz bu yerge dünyanın hemme yeriden oxşumuğan kişilik hukuk azaplarına duç kelgen barlıq adamlar yığılıp oturuptuk. Siz özünüz diyen boyunca tercüme kılın.
It's my great pleasure today to be among so many world-renowned human rights defenders who fight for freedom and human rights in their respective countries.
Biz bu yerge kelgenler bütün hemmimiz oxşumuğan halda özümüzün devletinde her kandak ezilgen ve kişilik hukuk duş kelgen hemmimiz oxşumuğan halda bedellerini tölep keldi.
I know that many among us sitting here have paid a heavy price in order to fight for freedom and human rights in our own countries. Many have been imprisoned, many even our loved ones have been killed by those brutal dictators. But the fight is worth it.
Biz hemmimiz küçümüzü birleştirip, ortaklaşıp bütün dünyadaki diktatörlerle ortak küreş kılıp başkalarının erkinliği ve başkalarının kişilik hukuku ve başkalarının azatlığı için ortak küreşini birlikte yapmağa vaktimizde çokum yer şardaki adaletsizlikini özgerteleyiniz.
Therefore, I believe that it's imperative for all of us to join hands together in our work for our common destiny for freedom and human rights and for democracy. Only when we all of us come together to fight against those brutal dictators and the powers of darkness, then there shall be freedom and human rights for all of our oppressed peoples in the world.
Biz de bugün muşu teşkilattın dünyanın hemme yerden çıkıp ortaklaştırdı. Mana muşundaq yaşla, muşundaq çıkka vaqtida dünyadaki her kandak bizni yokutumuzda vatkan, bizning xalqimizni oxşumuğan halda tügütümüzde vatkan ve xalqimizga azap okubatga akaganlardan bizni muşundaq kutuldurdu. Demek muşundaq teşkilatlarning, muşundaq yaşlarning xalqning ve taqdirini, yer şarının taqdirini özgerteleydiganligi ma'ishini.
For that, I'm extremely grateful for the Oslo Freedom Forum for bringing all of the human rights defenders around the world to come to this great country, the city of Oslo, to be together, to talk about human rights issues, to learn from one another, to fight for human rights. And so this forum is extremely important in promoting human rights globally.
Mening milletim Uyghur, mening vatanimning ismi Sharq Turkiston deb atiladi.
As you know, I'm ethnically Uyghur and I came from East Turkestan.
Mening vatanimni 1949 yılı Xitay komünistleri tarafından besip alıngan.
My homeland was occupied by the Chinese Communist forces in October 1949.
Onundan keyin bizge Şinjan, biz yerlik adamlar Uyghur bolganlygymız üçün bizge Xitay hökümeti biz sizlarga öz taqdiringlarni özüңlar belgileydigan qilib berimiz deb Şinjan Uyghur Avtonom rayon degan hukuk berilgan.
And after Chinese occupation, in recognition of the indigeneity of the Uyghur people, the Chinese government gave what is now the purported Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region and promised Uyghurs self-rule.
Bizge öz taqdiringlarni özüңlar belgileysizlar degan Xitay hökümeti özünün bizge bergen avtonom qonunni qat'iy ijro qilmay, bergen va'dasi tutmay, ta bugungacha qadar Uyg'urlar demokratiya, kişilik hukukdan söz etiş mümkün emas. Bir kunmu 61 yıldan beri bir kunmu tinchlikka erişemedi.
However, the Chinese government never honored its autonomy laws or its own constitution, but using the autonomy framework as a framework of persecution of the Uyghur people. Under 6 decades of brutal Chinese rule, the Uyghur people have never enjoyed any kind of human rights, freedom, or democracy, or even a day of peace.
Xitay hükümeti yalğız Mongollarni, Tibetlarni, Uyg'urlarni qattiq mushundaq diktatorlar ezib, assimilyatsiya qilib, mushundaq zulm selishlar emas, hatto o'zining Xitoy xalqining demokratiya, erkinlik, kishilik huquqini talab qilganini o'xshashli bostirib keldi.
As you well know, the Chinese government not only brutally persecutes the Uyghurs, the Tibetans, Mongols, other ethnic minorities, but also the majority Chinese population who want freedom and democracy from the Chinese government. They are also treated as the enemy of the Chinese state.
Xitay hükümeti hazır bizni Uyg'urlarni eng ig'ir Jungo'nun içinde eng ig'ir ahval tatıvatkan, eng köp qirg'inchilikqa duch kelayotgan millatning birisi biz.
However, the Uyghur situation is worse we face most severe and brutal persecution from the Chinese government.
Xitay hökuməti bizning xalqimizni 9 milyon 600 min deb e'lon qildi. Biz özimizni 20 milyon deymiz. Bizning ziminimiz Xitayning 6dan 1 qismini egallaydi.
And as you know, in terms of population size, the Chinese government put our number to 9.6 million. But the Uyghurs believe they are much more higher, up to 20. And the land mass is 1/6 of today's China. So China wants to have it for its own.
Bizning ziminimiz shuncha mol, may, bay, bütün neft gaz hamma narsadan chiqadi. Lekin biz hozir o'zimizning ona tilimiz va o'zimizning urf-odatimiz, o'zimizning iqtisodiy yuksalishimiz va o'zimizning bütün erkinligimizdan mahrum qilib, sistemalik assimilyatsiya qilyapmiz.
However, our land is blessed with rich natural resources: oil, gas, gold, uranium, coal, you name it. But the Uyghurs live the poorest there, losing all of their rights to the Chinese state, deprived by the Chinese state, being persecuted daily by the Chinese government for being the owners of that land, for being who we are, a unique indigenous population.
Xitay hökuməti bizning özümüzün ana tilimizni çəkledi, özünün avtonom qanunu xas. Hətta bizning adamlarimizni özümüzün vətənimizdə turuş imkanı yox. Neçə yüz minliğan qızlarımızı Xitay ölkələrinə məcburi 14 yaşdan 25 yaşqacha yetkəvatıdı.
Our own language cannot be spoken in our own homeland. Our own sons and daughters could not live and work in our own country. They've been forced and forcibly removed by the Chinese state to other Chinese provinces to work as cheap slave labor.
Biz özümüzün hak hukukumuz ve kişilik hukukumuz doğruluq, tinçlik bilen talep qılğanlar hamımız turmuğa taşınımız, ölüm cezası ve müddetli qamaq cezası hüküm qılınımız. Mesela mening bir ailemden yoldaşım 9 yıl, özüm 6 yıl, balam 7 yıl, 9 yıl 4 adam turmuğa elindi.
Any Uyghur who speaks out against the brutality of the Chinese government against our people is arrested, imprisoned, tortured, and executed in many cases. In my family alone, 4 of us have been imprisoned. My husband was imprisoned for 9 years. I was imprisoned for nearly 6. Currently, my 2 sons are serving lengthy prison terms, one 7, another 9 years.
Mana bütün Şərqi Türkistan'da bugünkü adam öldürülüyordu, bugünkü adam tutuluyordu. 2 günün aldıda yana ölüm cezasına 2 şəhərdə qolcu Ürümçidə ölüm cezasına tinçlik bilen namayış qatnaşqan tövünü 17 yaş yuqarı 25 yaşlıq balağa ölüm cezası qılındı.
China continues to brutalize the Uyghur people until this very day. Just 2 days ago, we were told that the Chinese authorities executed a dozen Uyghurs in 2 different cities of Ulja and other places.
Ben şuna məsələyə şundaq gəplərini sözləb bəgim ba, vaxt inayət qısqı bolğanlığı üçün menin gepimni tərcümə qilish bilan jiq vaxt ketməsin. Mening yardımçım, meninki bütün sözümni, yürək sözümni sizlərə oxub bəsin.
And I know time is precious, and I can go on talk about the tragedies and the plight of the Uyghur people. But because of time, I have a written statement. So I would like to have my spokesperson read it for you, if you do not mind.
Rahmet.
Thank you. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests. I would like to thank the organizers of the 2010 Oslo Freedom Forum. I'm honored in the presence of so many human rights defenders from around the world. Such a distinguished gathering of leaders in a struggle for human rights is testament to our common purpose and to the pressing human rights crisis across the globe. The event and our presence here recognize the truth and urgency behind Elie Wiesel's comment that indifference is not an option. Wherever there is evil and where people are suffering at the hands of unjust and brutal governments, we cannot remain silent. In the case of the Uyghur people in East Turkestan, occupied by China, people who are living in one of the darkest corners of the world, indifference is certainly never an option. We cannot be silent about the human rights atrocities being carried out against the Uyghur people and others. We must continue to speak out on behalf of those mothers whose sons are being tortured in Chinese prisons, the wives who are afraid to ask what happened to their husbands, and the children who are not allowed to speak their own very language. And my people are living in an open prison. That's why I must speak out on behalf of those suffering Uyghurs. I speak peacefully and struggle without weapons, while the Chinese government uses guns and bombs and instruments of torture to intimidate the Uyghur people. Still, the Chinese government is afraid of me because it's afraid of the truth. Chinese authorities have actively sought to discredit me and silence my voice all over the world. They have called upon governments not to issue me a visa. They have urged film festivals not to screen a film about my life. And they have urged organizations to rescind their speaking invitations to me, all because they are afraid of the impact of my words around the globe. They do not want the world to know the imprisonment, execution, religious repression, and cultural genocide that's taking place right now in our homeland of East Turkestan. This information punctures the Chinese government's veil of secrecy. Its attempt to present the world a picture of happy minorities living contentedly under benevolent Chinese rulers. As my fellow speaker, Paulding Gyaltsen, knows well, Uyghurs and Tibetans are not living happily under China's communist regime. The Chinese government is also afraid of organizations that I lead. Despite our small size relative to the massive Chinese propaganda machine, Chinese state media have aggressively campaigned to damage the reputations of the World Uyghur Congress and the Uyghur American Association, particularly during the past year, as we have struggled to present the world with an accurate picture of the peaceful demonstration and the violent unrest that rocked the regional capital of Urumqi in July 2009, and the subsequent crackdown on the Uyghur people. The Chinese government has attempted to smother the voice of these organizations, but we will not be silent. We will continue to report the truth of its dark rule. Chinese authorities tried to smother my voice by imprisoning me for nearly 6 years after I spoke out about the Uyghur human rights situation at China's parliament. Simply for speaking truth to power, I was forced to spend years in a tiny little cell. Many of my fellow Uyghur prisoners endured even worse abuses than I did. Today, when I speak to world audiences, I speak out for them as well. When I was released from prison and allowed to come to the United States in 2005, I tasted freedom for the first time. Before I was allowed to board the plane bound for the United States, my Chinese minders told me that I was not allowed to speak about the human rights situation of my people. They believed that they had the right to control my voice outside of China. I believe they also underestimate the power that one human voice can have when it speaks truth to power, and when it's not constrained by the binds of repressive governments. I had no choice but to continue to speak out on behalf of the Uyghur people in exile. In 2006, the Chinese government carried out its most egregious abuse against me in an attempt to stop my human rights activism. My sons imprisoned, my business destroyed, my money is confiscated, my family persecuted. As a mother, this has caused me great pain and grief. But I must speak up on behalf of my sons, not only on behalf of my sons, but also on behalf of the many imprisoned sons and the daughters of East Turkestan, and on behalf of the countless mothers who are suffering just as I am today. I cannot remain silent. Those of us living overseas especially have the duty to speak out on behalf of those who are not allowed to speak in repressive countries. Chinese authorities have even detained Uyghur journalists, bloggers, writers, historians after the July 5th brutal massacre of the Uyghur people. We know that Uyghur journalists, bloggers, Gayret Niyaz, Dilshad Perhat, the Arim website, webmaster Nur Ali, Mehmet Obel Qasim, and a lot of Uyghur writers and even academic Ilham Tohti are being imprisoned and not free today. Uyghur journalist, young Uyghur journalist Rebiya Kadeer was arrested by the Chinese government in 2008 for writing 2 critical articles of the Chinese government's forcible imposition of the Chinese language, replacing the use of the Uyghur language all over East Turkestan. Currently, nobody knows her whereabouts in China. East Turkestan remains partially cut off from the rest of the world through Chinese state-sanctioned, imposed phone and internet restrictions in order to cover up its crimes against the Uyghur people. International telephone communications was continuously blocked and heavily restricted for more than half a year after the July 5th. And internet is still pretty much down, except a few government-run websites functioning. And Uyghurs cannot use internet to freely communicate. For those Uyghurs who used cell phones to do text messaging, some of them have already been arrested by the Chinese authorities, accusing them sending messages splitting the country, sending harmful, disturbing messages. That's not in the interest of the Chinese government. These restrictions on the freedom of expression took place against the backdrop of one of the most turbulent periods in East Turkestan in modern history, with unrest, state brutality, and ethnic violence exposing deep social rifts and grossly flawed government policies. At present, more than 130,000 Chinese troops were being deployed by the Chinese government from other parts of China, in addition to the local troops, security forces, and police forces in the region, in order to crack down upon the peaceful Uyghur population. Following the death and injury of untold number of Uyghurs and some Han Chinese on July 5th and onward. The July 5th unrest in Urumqi has highlighted not only the government's systematic abuse of the Uyghurs' economic social rights, but also the political repression to silence Uyghurs' freedom of expression. Time and again, the Chinese government has ignored the international community, the calls of the international community, to ensure the due process of law for those Uyghurs tried and sentenced in connection with the unrest. We know that 34 people have already been sentenced to death. Many of them have already been executed. Secret torture and executions are ongoing. Those of us living in freedom must emulate those people who are not afraid of the evil powers, such as a Uyghur woman who stood up in front of rows of Chinese soldiers and tanks in protest against Chinese state brutality, to strive and speak out on their behalf. As we remember the risks of those human rights fighters and defenders in our respective countries and the price they pay for the freedom of our people, we are reminded even more of our responsibility to use the power of the voice we are given in the free world to speak out in the face of evil. We must continue to monitor the Chinese government's and all repressive governments' performance and urge China and other repressive regimes to adhere to internationally recognized human rights standards. We must call on China and all other repressive countries to listen to the grievances of the oppressed peoples, such as Uyghurs, and to act upon them through a constructive dialogue to settle the matters peacefully. So I'm extremely pleased to be able to speak to you today, and I would like to urge the continuous support of the human rights community for our cause for freedom and human rights. The Uyghur people have long appreciated your backing in our struggle for human rights, freedom, and democracy. Thank you.
Rahmet. Biz kişilik hukukka, kişilik hukuk için küreş kıldık. Kişilik hukuk ve erkinlik için kuraş kılganlığımız için muşu bizning Xitoy hukumatining biz düşman emas, biz diktatorlar, bizni düşman deb qaraydi. Amaliyotda kishilik huquq, erkinlik bo'lganda dunyoga tinchlik bo'ladi. Men bugun sizlar bilan yana birlikda cho'qim biz yer shariniki diktatorlarning taqdirini o'zgartirish uchun kurashga chaqiraman. Rahmat.
And I'm confident that dictators, authoritarians, totalitarians, they're all afraid of us being here today at this they're trembling right now because they're trembling at the voice of truth that we speak to them in the world. So I'm confident as long as we're together in this struggle, fight together, our people who live under those totalitarian, authoritarian, dictatorial regimes will be free. Thank you.